I've been driving long haul for nearly 15 years, seen the best and worst of the American highways. I've watched the sun rise over the Rockies, seen the neon glow of Vegas give way to the lonely nothingness of the Mojave. I've driven through blizzards in North Dakota, fog so thick in West Virginia you could swear the road didn't exist past your headlights. I've been tailgated by pissed-off commuters in Chicago, nearly run off the road by half-awake tourists in Florida. You spend enough time on the road, you think nothing surprises you. You think you've seen it all. I thought I had. But last week, something happened on a stretch of I-90 in Montana, just past a place called Deer Lodge, a place I know I'll never drive through again. I had a load to drop in Seattle, and I was making good time. The roads were empty, just me, a few distant headlights in the rear view, and an endless stretch of blacktop. Around 2:30 a.m., I pulled into a rest area. Nothing special, just one of those quiet pull-offs with a row of vending machines, a couple of tired picnic tables, and a bathroom that smelled like it hadn't been cleaned in a decade. I wasn't planning on stopping for long, just enough time to stretch my legs, maybe grab a coffee from the machine and get back on the road. Then I noticed something weird. There were cars parked in the lot, a handful of them, spaced apart like people had been careful not to park too close to each other. That wasn't the weird part. It was who was in them. Every car was occupied. The drivers all sat behind the wheel, motionless. No lights on, no engines running. Just sitting in the dark, hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead. Not checking their phones, not adjusting their mirrors. Just waiting. I got a bad feeling about it right away. I told myself it was nothing, that I was tired, seeing things that weren't there. But I kept watching them, waiting for something to break the unnatural stillness. It never did. Then I heard it. A faint tap 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 against the side of my trailer. My breath hitched. It wasn't wind, there was no wind. The night was still. Dead still. My first thought was maybe an animal, but the sound was too precise. Too deliberate. It moved along the side of my truck, a steady, rhythmic pattern, like someone dragging their fingers along the metal. I turned, expecting to see, what, exactly, a drifter? A hitchhiker? No one. I stepped back toward my cab, and that's when I noticed something else. The other drivers, the ones sitting motionless in their cars? They were all looking at me now. I swear to God, a second ago they were staring straight ahead. But now, every one of them had their heads turned, eyes locked onto me. No expressions. No movement. Just watching. I didn't stick around to figure out why. I climbed back into my rig, locked the doors, and fired up the engine. The second my lights flicked on, I could see it, movement in the trees beyond the rest area. A shape, something too tall, too thin, just at the edge of the darkness. Then the tapping started again. This time, on my window. I slammed my rig into gear and tore out of there, tires screeching against the asphalt. My trailer rocked as I hit the highway, but I didn't stop, didn't look back. It was only when I was miles down the road that I dared check my mirrors. Those cars? They were pulling out of the lot too. Every single one of them. And they were following me. As I pushed the truck faster than I should have, the needle creeping over the speed limit, I kept glancing at the convoy in my mirror, heart pounding harder than it had in years. This wasn't some coincidence. This wasn't some group of weirdos all just happening to leave the rest stop at the same time. Their headlights glowed too perfectly in sync, moving together, maintaining an exact distance behind me. No one was trying to pass. No one was slowing down. They just followed, mile after mile, the dark Montana highway stretching ahead of me like an open throat. The CB was silent. Too silent. I turned the dial, scanned through channels, hoping to hear something, a trucker chatter, a weather update, even just static, but the airwaves were empty. The usual hum of life on the road, the random truckers shooting the shit, the occasional cursing about a bad driver, none of it was there. I clicked the mic breaker 19, anyone got copy? Nothing. Any westbound drivers near mile marker 230 on I-90? Got convoy tailing me, looking for some eyes. Still nothing. That never happens. There's always somebody out there. Even at this hour. Even in the middle of nowhere. I tightened my grip on the wheel, sweat slicking my palms. Up ahead, a sign glowed in my headlights, an exit, 2 miles. I didn't recognize the name, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to keep rolling down this highway with this silent, unblinking caravan behind me. I flipped my turn signal out of instinct, because even when you're scared out of your mind, years of habit don't break, and took the ramp. The road curved, leading me into what should have been a small town, but as I rolled through, I realized something was off. The gas station was dark. The diner, one of those 24-hour spots, the kind you expect to at least have a single tired waitress wiping down the counter, was closed, chairs stacked on tables. No streetlights, no cars. No people. The whole town looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of the night, left to rot under the fluorescent glow of a handful of flickering signs. I slowed, scanning the empty sidewalks, the rows of darkened houses. No porch lights. No TVs flickering behind curtains. Just stillness. I kept rolling, telling myself I'd find something, a cop car, a late-night shift worker, anyone. Then I saw them. The cars. The same ones that had followed me from the rest stop. They were coming down the exit ramp behind me, headlights casting long, stretching shadows across the empty road. My pulse slammed in my throat. They had followed me here. This wasn't random. This wasn't just bad luck. Whatever this was, it was deliberate. I didn't know why. I didn't know who they were. But I knew one thing, I couldn't let them catch me. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, my 18-wheeler roaring as it tore through the dead town, rattling past empty storefronts and boarded-up windows. The road ahead curved sharply, disappearing into darkness, and I took it blindly, tires screaming as I fought to keep control. The convoy was right behind me. My rig groaned as I pushed it harder than I ever had, the weight of the load shifting dangerously, making the whole thing lurch like a wounded animal. The speedometer crept higher. 90. 95. The headlights behind me didn't falter. They weren't trying to pass me. They weren't trying to run me off the road. They were just keeping up, their movements too controlled, too perfect. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my breath catch. A figure. Standing in the middle of the road. Tall. Too tall. Limbs too long, too thin, its head tilted at an impossible angle. My headlights barely touched it before every light on my truck cut out at once. Darkness swallowed me whole, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't driving on any road I recognized anymore. I didn't slam the brakes. I should have. My instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn the wheel, to do something, but my hands locked on the wheel, my foot jammed against the pedal, and the truck surged forward into the void. The headlights were gone, the dashboard dead, every piece of electrical equipment wiped out in an instant, but I could still feel the road under me, the weight of the truck resisting my speed. It was as if the world had been swallowed by something thick and endless, something that absorbed light and sound and left only the dull hum of my own breath. And that thing, that figure, was still there, standing in my path, its silhouette burned into my mind even though I could no longer see it. The convoy was still behind me. I couldn't see their headlights anymore, but I felt them. I knew they hadn't stopped. The road stretched on into the abyss, and for a few seconds, minutes, it was just me in the blackness, the engine roaring uselessly in the silence, my pulse hammering so loud I could hear it in my skull. I was moving, but I couldn't tell if I was moving forward or if the world itself was shifting around me. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone, the light returned. My headlights flickered back on, weak at first, then bursting into full brightness, flooding the road ahead. The dashboard glowed to life, radio crackling with dead air, the CB a whisper of static. And the figure was gone. But the road was wrong. I was no longer in Montana. The highway I had been on was gone, replaced by something older, something unfamiliar. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, the painted lines faded almost to nothing. Tall trees loomed on either side, gnarled branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers, blocking out the sky. I tried to slow down, tried to get my bearings, but the truck didn't respond the way it should have. It felt heavier, the brakes sluggish, as if I were dragging something behind me. I glanced at my mirrors and nearly choked on my own breath. The convoy was still there, still following, but their headlights were dimmer now, flickering like candles in a storm. And there was something else behind them, something moving just beyond the reach of my lights, shifting through the trees, keeping pace with us. My hands tightened on the wheel as I tried to piece together what the hell was happening. There were no exits, no signs, no landmarks. Just the road, the trees, and the cars that refused to let me go. I hit the CB again, desperation creeping into my voice. Breaker 19, this is westbound out Deer Lodge. Anyone got copy? I need some eyes on this road. I don't. Static. Then, a voice, crackling and distant. You don't stop. You keep driving. You hear me? The voice was old, rough, like gravel scraping against metal. I gritted my teeth. Who is this? What road is this? Where the hell am I? A long pause. Then, don't look at them. My stomach clenched. Look at what? But the CB went dead again. I flicked my eyes to the mirrors. The convoy was still there, still keeping pace. But there was something else now. Shapes. Dark figures standing just off the road, lined up between the trees like a crowd at a funeral. They didn't move, didn't wave, didn't step forward. Just stood there, watching. And then, as I stared, one of them took a step onto the road. A woman, at least, it looked like a woman, thin, long hair hanging limp around her shoulders, a dress that might have once been white but was now stained with something dark. Her face was wrong. Not inhuman, not monstrous, but wrong, like a wax figure left too close to the heat. Her mouth was open, lips stretched too wide, but no sound came out. She lifted a hand, fingers trembling, reaching toward my truck. The voice on the CB had told me not to look. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. And then she moved. Not walked. Not ran. Moved. 1 second she was standing in the road, and the next she was right next to my window, her face inches from the glass, those two wide eyes locked onto mine. My hands jerked the wheel instinctively, the truck swerving dangerously before I could steady it. The woman's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, her lips curling around something silent. Then she was gone. I gasped for breath, knuckles white against the wheel, my body drenched in cold sweat. I forced my eyes forward, focusing on the road, on the broken pavement stretching ahead. But I could still feel them. The figures. The ones in the trees. The ones lining the road. They were closer now. The convoy wasn't chasing me anymore. They were hurting me. I didn't know where this road led, but I knew one thing, I wasn't getting off it until they decided I could. I gritted my teeth, forced my foot down on the pedal, and kept driving, deeper into the dark. I kept driving, hands locked on the wheel, my eyes burning from the effort of keeping them fixed on the road ahead. The figures in the trees weren't just standing anymore. They were moving, shifting closer with every mile, their silhouettes flickering like shadows cast by a dying fire. Some stepped to the very edge of the pavement, their feet just inches from the rumble strip, their heads tilting as if trying to see me better, to understand me, or maybe to make me understand them. I didn't want to understand. The convoy was still there, trailing me, headlights casting long beams into the unnatural dark. They never tried to pass. Never got closer. Just held their distance like shepherds herding an animal down a path it wasn't meant to walk. I tried to shake them, tested the brakes, the gas, even a slight swerve to see if they'd react, but nothing changed. The road was too narrow to turn around, too cracked and weathered to risk losing control. My CB remained silent. I didn't bother trying it again. Then, up ahead, the road widened. Not by much, just enough for an old service station to appear on the left, the kind that looked like it had been abandoned for decades, its rusted pumps still standing as relics of a forgotten time. A single light flickered above the entrance, casting a sickly glow over the dirt-streaked windows. The sign hanging from the roof had long since lost its lettering, leaving only the ghostly imprint of whatever name had once been there. And for the first time since I'd left that rest stop, I saw something living. A man stood beneath the awning, a cigarette dangling from his lips, one hand resting in the pocket of a grease-streaked jumpsuit. His face was lined, worn, like he'd spent his whole life in places no one was meant to be. He watched me approach, his expression unreadable. Then he lifted a single hand and weighed me down. Everything in me screamed to keep driving. But my hands betrayed me. The truck groaned as I pulled into the lot, gravel crunching beneath my tires. The convoy rolled past without slowing, headlights disappearing into the gloom ahead, but the figures in the trees stayed. They didn't follow. They just stood, waiting. I killed the engine, the sudden silence pressing against my ears. The man took one last drag of his cigarette before flicking it onto the cracked pavement, crushing the ember beneath his boot. Then he turned and walked inside, the door creaking open like it hadn't moved in years. He never looked back to see if I'd follow. I told myself I wouldn't. But then I stepped out of the truck anyway. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of old oil and something else, something that made my skin crawl. The light above the entrance buzzed, flickering like it was struggling to stay alive. I reached the door, hesitated. The glass was smeared with dirt and age, but I could still see inside. Shelves sat mostly empty, save for a few dusty cans and faded boxes. A counter stretched along the back wall, an ancient register perched on its edge. And behind that counter, the man was waiting. I pushed the door open, stepping into the dim light. "You shouldn't be here," he said. My throat was dry. I didn't have a choice. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer. He reached beneath the counter, pulled out a metal thermos, and poured something dark into a chipped ceramic mug. "You got followed." I swallowed hard. "Who are they?" He slid the mug toward me. "Drink first." I hesitated, staring at the steaming liquid. It smelled bitter, earthy, like something dug up from deep underground. But my hands were shaking, and the warmth called to me. I took a sip. It burned, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't alcohol. It wasn't coffee. It was something else, something that spread through me like fire and ice all at once. The man watched me, waiting. When I didn't collapse, he nodded again. "They're not people," he said finally. "Not like you and me. They've been here a long time. Long before the roads, long before the towns. They don't belong to anything but the dark." I set the mug down carefully. "Then what do they want?" His gaze flickered to the window, to the road where the convoy had disappeared. Somebody to take their place. A chill crept up my spine. "Whose place?" He didn't answer. Outside, the wind shifted. The figures in the trees moved closer. And I realized, whoever had been driving those cars before, they weren't driving them anymore. I sat there, gripping the chipped ceramic mug as the old man watched me, his eyes patient but knowing, like he had already lived this moment 1,000 times before. The figures outside hadn't moved, but I could feel them pressing against the edges of my awareness, their presence thick in the air like humidity before a storm. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of something unspoken, something inevitable. I didn't want to understand, but I knew I had no choice. I had been running blind for too long, and now I was sitting in the one place that might hold an answer, even if I wouldn't like it. The old man took another slow sip of whatever was in his cup, the way a man drinks when he knows time doesn't move the same way for him as it does for everyone else. "What do you mean, take their place?" My voice sounded different in this space, muted, like the walls swallowed it up before it could fully form. He exhaled slowly, setting his mug down with a hollow clink, fingers tapping the counter in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a man thinking about the best way to tell someone they were already dead. "They were men once," he said finally, voice low and steady, staring into the cup like it held something more than just liquid. "Drivers. Travelers. People like you, people who didn't know when to keep moving. Maybe they stopped at the wrong place, maybe they took the wrong exit, maybe they just got a little too curious about something that wasn't meant for them to see. But once you end up on this road, you don't leave unless something else takes your spot." The room felt smaller, pressing in around me, the air thick and stale like it had been trapped inside for years. My fingers tightened around the mug, though it had already begun to cool. You're saying they're trapped? I wasn't sure why I whispered, but it felt like I needed to. The old man shook his head, that same slow, inevitable motion. They were, he said, looking up at me now, the weight of his gaze settling over me like an iron chain. Now there's something else. Something hungry. Outside, the figures hadn't moved, but the weight of their attention was unbearable. The road behind me stretched into an unknowable distance, and I felt it then, the realization I had been too afraid to let settle in before. This wasn't some wrong turn, some backroad mistake I could just reroute from. I had crossed into somewhere else, somewhere I was never meant to be, and now I wasn't sure if the road ahead was leading me back out or dragging me deeper in. My hands trembled slightly as I set the mug down, though I forced myself to keep my voice even. I just need to get back to the highway, I said, not sure if I was telling him or reassuring myself. Back to the real one. If I can do that, if I can get out of here, then none of this matters, right? His face didn't change, but I saw something in his eyes then, something almost like pity, like watching a man clutch a lifeline that had already been cut. If you could do that, he said, you think you'd still be sitting here, drinking this? He gestured to my cup, and for the first time, I really looked at it. The liquid inside wasn't just black anymore. It was dark, yes, but there was a depth to it that shouldn't have existed in a simple cup of coffee. It shifted, moved in ways that didn't belong to liquid at all. It wasn't reflecting light, it was swallowing it, like a hole punched through reality itself, something deeper than the bottom of a mug should allow. My breath hitched as I pushed it away so quickly that it nearly tipped over, my pulse hammering in my throat. What the hell is that? My voice came out hoarse, but the old man only smirked, the first real emotion I'd seen from him. Just something to help you see, he said. My stomach turned. See what? His smirk faded, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost resigned. That you were never supposed to leave. The sound came then. Not from the station, not from the road, but from everywhere. It was low at first, something deep and guttural, a groan stretched too long, too hollow, rising into a whistle, something unnatural and wrong. The air shifted, something rippling through it that I couldn't see but could feel, and outside, the figures finally reacted. They turned, all at once, their heads tilting toward the road, their bodies suddenly too still in a way that made my skin crawl. They heard it. They recognized it. And whatever it was closer now. The old man stood, his movements slow but sure, like a man who had already accepted his place in whatever this was. Time's up, he said. My breath hitched. What? He nodded toward the door, toward the waiting figures, toward the open road beyond them. You need to go. I stared at him, feeling something claw at my throat, something close to panic. I just got here. His expression didn't change. And that was your second mistake. The sound came again, closer this time, and it felt like the walls trembled slightly, like something enormous had stirred beneath the surface of reality itself. My pulse pounded as I took a step back, heart hammering so hard it drowned out my own breath. What the hell was my first? The old man met my eyes, steady, calm, certain. Stopping. The third sound came, and I didn't wait this time. I turned, feet moving before I could think, before I could hesitate, because whatever that sound belonged to, I didn't want to be here when it arrived. I shoved open the door, stepping into the cold, into the night, into the waiting silence that swallowed me whole. And the road wasn't empty anymore. The convoy had stopped. The cars sat in a perfect line, headlights flickering weakly, but they weren't empty. The doors were wide open, gaping, waiting, and the drivers, the ones who had been in them before, were gone. But they weren't truly gone, because now they stood between the cars, between the gaps, between the spaces where no one should have been. The figures had moved from the trees. And they were closer. And they were waiting. I turned back toward the station, searching for the old man, for something, anything, but the door was closed. The inside was empty, dark, abandoned, like no one had ever been inside at all. My chest tightened. I hadn't imagined him. I hadn't imagined any of this. And I hadn't imagined the way the figures were smiling now, slow and wide, like they already knew what choice I was going to make. There wasn't a choice. There was only forward. There was only driving. There was only becoming one of them, or getting away before it was too late. My hands moved on instinct, pulling open the door of my rig, climbing inside before I could let myself second-guess the motion. My fingers wrapped around the key, turning it hard, and for one terrible moment, the engine hesitated. A heartbeat, a second of nothing, and in that space, in that silence, I heard it, the sound of something moving toward me, fast. Then the engine roared to life, and I hit the gas so hard the tires screamed against the pavement. The rig lurched forward, the figures blurring past the edges of my vision, their heads turning as I sped by, their mouths moving even though I couldn't hear the words. I didn't look back. I didn't check the mirrors. I only drove, hands tight on the wheel, breath ragged, praying that wherever this road led next, it wouldn't be worse than what I had already seen. I kept my hands locked on the wheel, knuckles tight and aching as the truck barreled forward, tearing away from that station, from those figures, from whatever had just barely missed grabbing hold of me when the engine had hesitated. The road stretched out ahead, the bridge looming in the distance, rusted steel beams twisted with time and decay, its structure fragile under the weight of whatever had been forgotten here. I wasn't thinking anymore, not consciously, not with logic or reason. I was running, fleeing, driving blindly into whatever was waiting ahead, because the only other option was stopping, and I already knew what happened to those who stopped. The bridge was old, too old, the kind of structure that should have been condemned decades ago, but there was no other way forward. The trees pressed in from both sides, thick and tangled, their branches curling over the road like skeletal fingers reaching for something just out of their grasp. The pavement cracked beneath me, and for the first time, I felt every single imperfection in the road, like my truck was fighting against something unseen, like the very ground beneath me was trying to resist letting me pass. As I hit the entrance of the bridge, the atmosphere changed. The sound of my tires against the road shifted, became hollow, weightless, like I had driven onto something that wasn't really there. The dashboard lights flickered, the engine let out a deep groan, and I felt a weight settle over me, thick and suffocating, like the very air had turned into something heavy enough to drag me under. The mirrors showed nothing but darkness, a void stretching behind me, and though I couldn't see them, I could feel them, those figures, those watchers, no longer standing at the edge of the road but following, keeping pace, waiting for something. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tightened my grip, keeping my focus locked on the road ahead, refusing to let my eyes drift to the edges, refusing to acknowledge the movement I knew was there, the shapes flickering just at the corners of my vision, creeping closer with every second. Then I saw it. Standing at the very center of the bridge, just barely illuminated by my failing headlights, was something. Not a man, not a shadow, not something I could name in any way that made sense to the part of my brain still clinging to reality. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs too long, its body stretched thin like it had been pulled apart and stitched back together wrong. Its face was featureless, smooth and empty, and yet I knew it was looking at me, that it saw me in a way nothing else ever had. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn, to do anything but keep moving toward it, but stopping was not an option. The bridge groaned beneath me, metal protesting my weight, and for the first time, I realized that it was getting longer. The other side, the end of the bridge, should have been visible by now, but it wasn't. The more I drove, the further it stretched, pulling itself outward like it was unraveling in real time, an endless tunnel of rust and shadow. The figure at the center did not move, did not shift, did not react as I hurtled toward it, and yet I knew that something was happening, something just beyond my understanding. The CB crackled to life again, and I nearly jumped at the sound, my pulse spiking. The voice was there, the same voice that had warned me before, rough and distant, but this time, there was something different in its tone. It wasn't just warning me, it was pleading. "Don't look at it," the voice rasped, broken by static, the words nearly lost in the distortion. "Whatever you do, don't look at its face." My chest tightened, breath catching in my throat, because I had looked, I was looking, and even though the face was empty, even though there were no features, no eyes, no mouth, it was looking back at me. I forced my gaze down, locking onto the cracked pavement, blinking hard, trying to scrub the image from my mind, but it was there, burned into my vision, the hollow shape of something that did not belong here, something that had been waiting long before I had ever stepped onto this cursed stretch of road. The truck shuddered, the steel beneath me groaning, and suddenly the weight behind me wasn't just falling anymore. It was pulling. The trailer jerked violently, the entire rig lurching as if something had grabbed hold, something massive, something hungry. My speed dropped instantly, from 80 to 70, 70 to 60, the resistance growing, the truck fighting against whatever was trying to drag it backward. I slammed my foot against the gas pedal, but it was like driving through mud, the wheels straining, struggling, barely keeping forward momentum. The CB crackled again, the voice more frantic this time. "It knows you," it said, and this time, the static wasn't covering the sound of something else behind it, something whispering, something laughing. My stomach lurched as the trailer tilted, the weight behind it suddenly shifting, pulling at an angle that didn't make sense, like the very laws of physics had started to bend. I risked a glance in the mirror, and for the first time since I had started running, I saw them. The figures weren't standing anymore. They were crawling, their elongated limbs stretched unnaturally, their fingers gripping onto the sides of the trailer, onto the steel beams of the bridge, onto each other, forming a writhing mass of shapes that clung to the back of my truck like a living organism, their hollow faces turned upward, their mouths moving soundlessly. They weren't just following. They were climbing in. I felt something cold at the base of my skull, a pressure, a tingling, a sensation like fingers pressing into my thoughts, sifting through my memories, my fears, my name. My grip on the wheel faltered as the whispers from the CB grew louder, clearer, but they weren't coming from the radio anymore. They were inside my head. I slammed my foot down harder, my breath ragged, my body drenched in cold sweat, forcing the truck forward with everything I had, but it wasn't enough. The thing on the bridge, the tall one, was still there, still waiting, still standing in my path, and I knew, without understanding how I knew, that if I reached it, if I got too close, if it touched me, I would never leave this road again. The CB crackled once more, and this time, the voice was barely there, barely more than a whisper beneath the static. "You have to jump." The words didn't make sense. Jump? Off the truck? Off the bridge? There was nothing below, nothing but darkness, nothing but that silent, unmoving river that wasn't really a river at all. My mind rebelled against the idea, clinging to reason, to logic, to survival instincts that told me jumping was death, but the voice came again, weaker now, fading, like it was being pulled away from me. "It's the only way." The bridge trembled beneath me. The truck lurched again, the figures gaining ground, the weight behind me becoming unbearable, dragging me backward, pulling me towards something I didn't want to see, something I couldn't see and stay human. The thing ahead had started to move, its head tilting, its arms beginning to rise. I had maybe 3 seconds before I reached it. I didn't have a choice. I unbuckled my seatbelt, grabbed the door handle, and prayed that wherever I landed, it would be somewhere real. Then I jumped. The world tilted. The rush of air tore at my skin as I plummeted, my body weightless for a sickening moment before I hit something hard. Pain exploded through my shoulder, rattling down my spine, but I couldn't focus on that. I had to move. I was no longer in the truck. I was no longer on the bridge. My body rolled, momentum throwing me across what felt like rough pavement, jagged gravel scraping my arms, my back, my face. Somewhere behind me, the truck screamed, metal twisting, groaning, something breaking apart in a way that no machine ever should. I forced my eyes open. Darkness. A road. Not the bridge. The surface beneath me was cracked, uneven, but solid. I wasn't falling anymore. My lungs dragged in a breath, and that's when I realized the most terrifying thing of all, I could still hear it. The whispering. The scraping. The pulling. My body screamed in protest as I pushed myself up, my muscles stiff, bruised from the impact, but I couldn't stop, couldn't waste time trying to understand what had just happened. I turned toward the wreck, expecting to see my truck overturned, shattered on the road. It was gone. The bridge was gone. The road behind me stretched into pure blackness, an absence of space, a void where something should have been. The highway should have continued back the way I came, but it didn't. There was no sign of the steel trusses, no sign of my rig, no wreckage, no fire, nothing. Just a cut, like reality had been sliced cleanly away with a blade, and whatever had been on the other side had simply ceased to exist. My breath came in sharp, gasping pulls, my ribs aching with every inhale. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then, where the hell was I? The road ahead stretched forward, empty, disappearing into more dark. The only light came from a single street lamp in the distance, standing crooked on the side of the road, its sickly yellow glow barely reaching the cracked pavement beneath it. Beyond that, shadows flickered between the trees, and I knew without needing to see clearly that they were still there. Watching. Waiting. The CB crackled. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The noise came from behind me, but there was nothing behind me, no truck, no radio, nothing but the edge of the void. And yet the voice came through, distant, fractured. "You're not done yet," it rasped, weaker now, as if something was pulling it away. "Keep going. Don't stop. Don't let them catch you." My legs felt like lead, my body still shaking from the fall, but I forced myself to move. One foot forward. Then another. My boots crunched against the road, the sound deafening in the silence, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The street lamp flickered as I approached, the bulb buzzing like a dying insect, and for a brief, horrible second, I felt something behind me, right behind me, a breath of cold air at the nape of my neck, the sensation of fingers barely grazing my shoulder. I ran. My body protested, but my instincts took over, my boots pounding against the asphalt, breath sharp and ragged as I hurtled toward the lamp, toward the only source of light in this place. The moment I crossed into its glow, everything behind me stopped. The whispers cut off. The air went still. I turned, chest heaving, body tense, but there was nothing. Just the road. Just the trees. Just the empty, endless dark stretching back toward nothing. My hands trembled as I wiped at my face, feeling warmth, blood, probably, from the fall, from the gravel, but I didn't care. I was still alive. I was still here. But where the hell was here? The lamp above me buzzed, and that's when I noticed the sign. It was old, barely hanging from rusted metal, the letters faded but still legible. Crystal River, 1 mile. My stomach turned violently. I had seen that name before. It was on the damn rule sheet from the quick track train. The one that said, "There is no station called Crystal River. If the intercom announces a stop there, close your eyes until the train has passed." I was never supposed to be here. The lamp flickered again, and I realized the dark beyond the road was shifting, something moving, something coming closer. The rules hadn't said what happened if someone actually arrived at Crystal River. But I was about to find out. I took one last breath and started walking toward the sign. Whatever waited ahead, I was going to have to face it. Because stopping wasn't an option. Not anymore. I kept walking, each step unsteady, my legs weak from the fall, my body aching from the impact. The night pressed against me, thick and suffocating, the road stretching forward in a way that felt wrong, too empty, too long, as if it wasn't really leading anywhere but was instead keeping me moving, keeping me trapped. The sign said Crystal River, 1 mile, but it felt like I had been walking for much longer than that. The road didn't curve, didn't change, didn't show any sign of a town ahead, just an endless stretch of cracked asphalt flanked by the dense, towering trees that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I didn't want to look at them at all. The street lamp flickered behind me, its weak yellow glow shrinking into the distance until it was gone, swallowed by the dark. I was alone again, walking toward a place that shouldn't exist, a town that was never supposed to be reached. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that wasn't just absence of sound but waiting, like the world itself was holding its breath. My boots scraped against the road, the only noise in the endless quiet, and even that felt wrong, like I was intruding on something that didn't want me there. I didn't know if the CB would work, if I was even reachable anymore, but I pressed the button on my portable and tried anyway. "Is anyone out there?" My voice came out rough, hoarse, like I hadn't spoken in hours. I hesitated, unsure what I was even asking for. Help? An explanation? I don't know where I am. The static was immediate, sharp and grating, but beneath it, something stirred, low, distant, not quite words, but not just noise either. I held my breath, waiting, hoping for the voice that had warned me before, but it never came. Instead, the static shifted, becoming something wet, organic, like the sound of breath against a speaker, of something listening. I dropped the CB from my mouth, gripping it tighter, my pulse hammering against my skull. The whispering hadn't started yet, but I felt it, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. I kept moving. I didn't have a choice. Then I saw the first house. It rose out of the dark like a mirage, an old two-story structure set back from the road, its windows black and empty, its wooden siding warped with age. No lights, no cars, no signs of life. Just standing there, waiting. Then another. And another. Houses appearing one by one, dotting the roadside in a way that felt too deliberate, too placed, as if they hadn't been built but had simply arrived, structures born from the road itself rather than anything human. Crystal River. The town was here. But it wasn't real. The moment I stepped past the first house, the road changed. The air shifted, grew thicker, heavier, and for the first time since I had left the truck, I heard something else. Not the whispering, not the static, but a sound so normal, so mundane that it sent a bolt of nausea through me, music. It was faint, distant, the old crackling hum of a record player spinning in some unseen house, a slow, scratchy tune that belonged to another time. The notes dragged, warping slightly as if the needle was struggling to stay on track. A single, eerie waltz carrying through the night air, curling around the town like mist, pulling me further in. I clenched my jaw, my feet faltering. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, to leave now before it was too late, but there was nowhere else to go. Then, up ahead, the streetlights flickered on. One by one, dim pools of yellow light blinked to life, lining the road ahead, illuminating the rest of the town, the storefronts, the old brick buildings, the narrow alleys swallowed by shadow. The street was empty, but it wasn't. The moment the lights came on, I felt them, eyes, attention, something watching me. I scanned the windows, the doorways, the alleys, but nothing moved. No figures. No shapes. Just that oppressive, waiting presence. The music continued. I forced myself forward, my body tense, my hands shaking at my sides. The town wanted me here. That much was clear. And I knew, somehow, that stopping in the middle of the street was a mistake. I had to keep going. The street led me to a small square, the heart of Crystal River, where a rusted old fountain sat dry and cracked in the center. The buildings surrounding it were faded, their signs too worn to read, their windows smudged with dust. A general store. A barber shop. A diner. All frozen in time, untouched by age yet abandoned, like a town that had been left behind mid-step, the ghosts of its last residents lingering in the spaces they had once occupied. Then, finally, I saw movement. A figure stood at the edge of the square, just at the edge of the dim streetlight glow. At first, it was still, just standing there, watching me, waiting. My breath hitched as it took a step forward, then another, moving toward me with slow, deliberate intent. I wanted to move, wanted to run, but my body locked up, every muscle frozen as if the very air around me had turned solid. As it stepped into the light, I realized I knew its face. It was me. Or almost me. The same height, the same build, the same clothes, but not right. The proportions were off, the movements too smooth, like something wearing a skin it hadn't quite figured out how to use. Its head tilted, and I finally saw its eyes, wide, vacant, hollow, but behind that emptiness was something worse. Something waiting to take. It smiled. And then it moved. Not walked, not ran, just shifted, from feet away to right in front of me in the space of a single breath. Its mouth still stretched in that hollow, skin-tight grin, its head tilted too far, its eyes locked onto mine. My heart stopped. My mind screamed. It opened its mouth. And in my own voice, it whispered, "I think I'll take this one." My body finally responded. I turned and ran. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back, didn't stop to process the impossibility of what I had just seen, myself, but not myself, something wearing my face like it had been trying it on, like it had already decided it fit just fine. My boots slammed against the cracked pavement, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts, my lungs burning as I sprinted past the empty storefronts, past the dead fountain, past the windows that weren't empty anymore. They were watching now. Faces peered from behind smudged glass, too still, too hollow, their mouths open in silent expressions of something that wasn't quite hunger, wasn't quite recognition, but something in between. The street lights above me flickered, casting long, stretched shadows, making the figures in the windows seem to move even though I knew they hadn't. The air was heavy with that feeling again, the thick, suffocating weight of being watched, of being expected. This town wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. And somehow, I had stepped into the space it had left open. A place that needed filling. The music was still playing. That eerie, crackling waltz carried on, the old record skipping slightly with each loop, and with every step I took, it felt closer, like it wasn't coming from a single source anymore, but from the town itself, from the buildings, from the streets, from the very air around me. My feet skidded as I turned down an alley, pushing deeper into the maze of decaying structures, hoping, praying that there was an exit, a break in the buildings, something that would lead me out. But Crystal River wasn't letting me go. Up ahead, the alley opened into another street, another row of houses and storefronts that looked exactly like the one I had just left. My pulse slammed against my skull as I skidded to a stop, my mind scrambling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a small town. It was looping. I turned sharply, running back toward the way I had come, my boots pounding against the pavement, but when I burst out of the alley, the square was gone. The fountain, the buildings, the streets, I was somewhere else, or worse, right where I had started. And standing in the center of the road, waiting for me, was me. The thing wearing my face hadn't chased me. It hadn't needed to. It was already here, already waiting, like it had known exactly where I would go, like it had known there was nowhere else to go. Its expression hadn't changed, that skin-tight grin stretched too wide, the hollow space behind its eyes too deep, too empty. It took a step forward, slow, patient, casual. It wasn't in a rush. It didn't need to be. I backed away, my body shaking, my breath coming too fast, my fingers twitching uselessly at my sides. I had nothing. No weapons, no plan, no exit. The CB was dead. The truck was gone. I was alone in a town that should not exist, staring at something that wanted to take my place, something that was already wearing me like it had been practicing. It spoke again, and hearing my own voice come from its mouth made my stomach twist violently. "You're almost ready," it said, tilting its head slightly, considering. But not quite. I shook my head, my hands clenching into fists, trying to push down the rising panic, the creeping horror of understanding what it meant. "I'm not staying here." My voice was rough, shaking, but I forced the words out, because if I didn't say it, if I didn't make it real, then maybe I had already lost. The thing smiled wider. "That's what the others said." My blood turned to ice. The others. The convoy. The drivers. The ones who had followed me from the rest stop. The ones who had already taken their place here. I had known, somehow, that they weren't people anymore. That whatever had been behind the wheels of those cars hadn't been human for a long time. But I had never let myself consider what they had been before. They had been me. Not me, exactly. Not the same person. But the same kind of person. A trucker. A driver. A traveler who had made a wrong stop, taken a wrong road, stepped into a place that needed filling. And one by one, they had stopped running. They had given in. They had let something else take the wheel. I wasn't going to let that happen. I turned and ran again, but this time, I didn't take the alley. I didn't take the streets. I went for the buildings. My shoulders slammed into a glass door, the old wood creaking as I shoved it open, stepping into the darkened space of what had once been a diner. The tables were still set, the chairs still in place, the smell of something rotting thick in the air, but I didn't stop. I sprinted toward the back, toward the kitchen, toward anywhere but the streets, my hand slamming against another door, pushing through into another hallway that shouldn't have been there. The walls were wrong. Too narrow, too long, the floor stretching out in a way that made my stomach turn, like I was walking down something that wanted to be a hallway but didn't quite know how to be one. The doors on either side were warped, some too tall, some too narrow, all leading to places I did not want to see. But I kept moving forward, my heartbeat loud in my ears, the sound of my breath too sharp in the suffocating silence. Then, ahead of me, the hallway ended. A single door waited there, larger than the rest, its handle rusted, its frame warped like something had been pulling at it from the other side. The waltz music was louder now, coming from behind that door, looping, skipping, waiting. I hesitated, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back, to run, to get out. But there was no out. I reached for the handle, my fingers shaking, my breath uneven. The metal was warm, almost alive, like it had been waiting to be touched. I swallowed hard, forced down the bile rising in my throat, and turned it. The door opened. And on the other side, I was sitting at a diner booth. Not just any booth. That booth. The one I had sat in 100 times at truck stops just like this one, eating a late-night meal between long stretches of road, staring at a plate of something I barely tasted, listening to the hum of tired conversation, the clatter of dishes, the low hum of a radio playing some old, forgotten song. Except there was no conversation. No other diners. No servers. Just me. Sitting there, staring at the plate, not moving, not eating. I took a step inside, my legs heavy, my head light, my breath caught somewhere in my chest. The other me looked up. And smiled. I turned to run, but the door behind me was gone. I was inside. And the booth wasn't empty anymore. I didn't sit down. I wouldn't let myself. My breath came fast and uneven, my hands trembling at my sides as I stared at myself, the version of me sitting in that diner booth, the one that wasn't moving, wasn't blinking, wasn't doing anything except waiting. The plate in front of it was full. Pancakes, eggs, bacon, exactly the kind of meal I would have ordered at a roadside diner, the food still steaming like it had just been set down. But the coffee was black. Too black. That same endless, swallowing darkness I had seen in the old man's mug back at the service station. The other me smiled. "You're almost ready," it said, and the voice was mine, but not quite. It was too smooth, too steady, the kind of voice that didn't need to shake anymore. The kind that had already accepted what it was. I shook my head, taking a step back even though there was nowhere to go. The door was gone, the wall stretching into a dim nothingness beyond the booth, the kind of space that felt unfinished, like a dream still forming, a half-built world waiting to be occupied. "I'm not staying here." My voice came out rough, shaking, my pulse hammering in my throat. The thing across from me, the thing wearing me, tilted its head slightly, like it was considering something, like it was weighing my words against some measure I couldn't see. "You've already been here longer than you think," it said, motioning to the empty seat across from it. "Might as well sit down." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. The music, that waltz, was still playing, looping endlessly from nowhere, from everywhere. The smell of food was thick in the air, but it wasn't real. None of it was real. The food wasn't meant to be eaten. The coffee wasn't meant to be drunk. It was just part of the process. I took another step back, scanning the space, my mind racing for an out, for a way to break whatever this was before it broke me. The town had looped. The road had stretched. The bridge had disappeared. It had all been leading to this. The thing in the booth sighed, shaking its head like it was disappointed. "You don't get it yet, do you?" Its grin widened, stretching too far, its skin pulling just a little too tight over its face. "You're not leaving." I ran. I didn't care that there was no door, no exit, no direction that made sense. I just moved, sprinting away from the booth into the stretching dimness of the half-formed world, my boots slamming against the ground even though I wasn't sure there was ground anymore. The air thickened around me, pulling at my limbs, resisting my movements, but I fought against it, pushing forward, my breath sharp, my heartbeat erratic. Then, a wall. Not a diner wall, not a door, but something solid, something massive. My body collided with it at full speed, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs, and for a second, I thought I had run straight into nothingness itself. But then I felt it. Metal. The side of my truck. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my hands slamming against the steel as I turned, wild and desperate, trying to understand what had just happened. The diner was gone. The booth was gone. The thing that had been wearing my face, gone. And the truck was running. The door was open, the cab lights glowing weakly, the faint hum of the engine vibrating through the steel. I didn't question it. I didn't hesitate. I climbed in. The moment I was in the seat, the road returned. I didn't see it shift. I didn't feel it change. It just was. The cracked pavement stretched out ahead of me, the buildings of Crystal River shrinking in the mirrors, dissolving back into the nothingness they had come from, the streetlights winking out one by one. My hands locked around the wheel, my foot pressed against the pedal, and the truck rolled forward, slow at first, then faster, faster, the road smoothing beneath my tires, the world stabilizing, the music finally fading into silence. I was driving. I was out. I didn't look back. Not at the town. Not at the mirrors. Not at the empty space where the convoy should have been. I just kept going, watching as the miles stretched behind me, as the sky began to lighten with the first hint of morning. And then, finally, I saw it. A sign. A real, human sign. Seattle, 240 miles. The highway was back. The real highway. The radio crackled softly with the familiar chatter of truckers calling in miles, reporting weather, swapping stories. The kind of noise that had never sounded so good in my life. I was back. I drove until the sun had fully risen, until I reached a truck stop packed with rigs, the smell of diesel and coffee thick in the air, the sound of real, living people moving around me. I parked, stepped out, and just stood there, letting the normalcy of it all sink in, grounding myself in the weight of my own body, the steady pulse of life moving as it should. But even as I breathed in the morning air, even as I told myself I was safe, I knew the truth. I hadn't been the first. And I wouldn't be the last. Because somewhere, out there on the road, there was still a rest stop where the cars never turned off. Still a bridge that stretched too far. Still a town that wasn't on any map. And somewhere, something was still waiting for another traveler to make the wrong stop. To take the wrong road. To stay too long. I climbed back into my truck, turned the key, and got the hell out of there.